I'm Nick. This is 10 Minutes with Nick. And I wanted to talk through an issue that I actually talked about on Saturday in a news segment that I'm going to debut on 10 Minutes with Nick, where I actually had a guest on the podcast. Now, this week's episode that will be uploaded not this week, but that was recorded this week, was called 10 Minutes with Josh. And I brought on a friend of mine, Josh Pickman, who is a member of the British military. And he gave me a really nice, really interesting insight into viewing how the military training program has changed as we've moved from generation to generation. Now, the military is in a very interesting, and I've used the word interesting 3 times. I apologize for that. But the military is in an interesting position to watch generational changes. Because, for example, Josh is in my generation, right? In the last podcast, I was talking a little bit about this, but my generation lived through the 9/11 attacks and the coalition of the willing and that whole bit from, we lived in a very military time. Now, we currently also live in a military time, but, we're not actively engaged in the war in Ukraine. We know it's happening, but, other than training exercises, we're not actively engaged in that. So Josh made a really interesting point about how he was trained when he came up through the military. He was trained by men and women who had been to war, who had actively deployed to battle. That's not the same now. And it says nothing. And as he notes, and as he specifically makes a point of noting, that says nothing about the skill or the bravery or the aptitude of the trainers. They're still, if you're training people, you're still best of the best. But it's interesting to note how that evolution follows when you have war fighters training war fighters, or when you have theorists training war fighters. Now, again, it's just an interesting academic point right now. There's no great conclusion to draw from it. I don't want this to end up on Red Pill. I don't want this to end up on as a talking point somewhere. It's just interesting. And it's just something to note about the generational change. And the one thing that generational change has driven, because my voice cracked like a 12-year-old boy there, it's driven an interesting development in people. It used to be, according to my friend Josh, and again, this will come up in the podcast episode that I will release later on. It's just taking longer to edit because it is not 10 minutes, it is an hour. He made an interesting, I've said interesting 17 times. He made an intuitive remark about the true differences in the generations. Millennials had a built-in deference to an elder. And if you're a millennial, you've probably been in therapy for it. If you're older than us, we sort of defer to you. It's built into our heads because we were the generation that we were probably the last generation that, went to church and everything else with our families on Sundays, because as millennials started to have kids, they didn't really do that. They started to fade out from that. The new generation does not have that deference built in. What it has is a built-in questioning. It has built-in questioning. And that questioning extends even to the military. So what that tells you is that it is part of who they are, is just questioning of everything around them, questioning the world around them. Even to be so brazen as to question military training staff who are trying to turn you into soldiers, whose job it is to turn you into soldiers, for a job you volunteered for. You've chosen to go this road, and they still want to question that. What does that tell us about them? Well, it tells us they have, in the best of senses, it tells us they have a curious mind. So the next generation is far more curious about the world around them. They have a rebellious mind. And Josh specifically noted that. They have a rebellious mind with really nothing to rebel against, or they find things to rebel against. I say in the case, I argue that there's nothing to rebel against, and people will disagree with me on this. They'll say, well, they can rebel against, government and the patriarchy and everything else. You can't. The idea of rebelling against a concept is very difficult. When somebody, and you can't, and I'm going to argue that if you said to me, oh, people rebelled against slavery, that's true, but it was slavery. They didn't rebel against slavery as a concept. They rebelled against slavery as an institution. It just so happened that the institution and the concept went hand in hand. They didn't rebel. It's hard to rebel against something that is sort of a nebulous concept. Like rebelling against the patriarchy, it doesn't have much of a resolution to it, because how do you succeed? Well, we succeed when everything is torn down and what? If a new form of oppression were to come into play, even though patriarchy is gone, is that a win? No, it's not. Patriarchy as a concept concepts are very difficult to rebel against. You have to rebel against things. You have to rebel against specific tangible institutions and people, because you have to be able to overthrow the thing you're rebelling against. So when you have a generation that's used to rebelling against concepts, meaning that they're sort of just rebelling with no way to win, they end up in situations where, even though they volunteered to be in the military, they're rebelling against the military because they have a target. A target has presented itself to rebel against. And, this natural tendency to rebellion, it's not a bad thing. It's actually quite a good thing. It's a very democratic thing. I almost said it's a very American thing, but the example I used came from the British military, so I don't know if that's true in the American military. It might be. I just don't know. It's a very democratic thing, because the democracy is a concept, right? But the democratic institutions that run countries are not concepts. They are very tangible. And when those institutions become stagnant, as they have in America, as they likely have in England, when you have, for example, in the United States, I'll give the example, leadership that's been in power since they were 26, but their 20s were in like the 1950s, and they're now, they're getting way up there. They're like 80s. That requires rebellion. Like not physically overthrowing, but intellectual rebellion. Questioning. Well, why don't we have age limits? If people are going to live so long, why don't we have age limits or term limits, or require something to recycle out old ideas and bring in new ideas? That's rebellion. And that's the rebellion that Gen Z and Gen Alpha, I think, have inherently, that millennials sort of have to sort of bring out of their shell more. And I think that that's quite a good thing. I don't know if it's definitely not a good thing in the military. And I think Josh and I talked about this, and in that interview, I sound very pro no rebellion. But I think intellectual rebellion could be quite a good thing if you reframe it in the way of finding the institutions that need some kind of intellectual rebellion against them. And I think democratic institutions are sort of built to handle that rebellion, and in fact built to welcome that rebellion. I'll talk about that another time, because we've already reached the 10-minute mark. Thanks for listening to my ramble. If you enjoyed it, drop me a follow. Join the 14 people who are following me now. If you didn't enjoy it, well, then don't follow me. But hey, thanks for listening. Appreciate you being here. I'm Nick. This was 10 Minutes with Nick. Have yourself a great day.